Fire your team. I'm tired of people who don't know their place. This company needs a leader like me right now.
You can't end anyone's career. And I always know my place. It's higher than your anger.
My name is Percival Brooks, and the morning I got fired taught me exactly how dangerous entitlement can be when it wears a smile and a family name. It started like any other weekday. I was in my office before sunrise, coffee cooling beside a stack of reports for our largest logistics client, the same account that had quietly kept Hawthorne Solutions afloat the previous year. I'd built that relationship myself over 6 years, contract by contract, mistake by mistake. That's when the door swung open. Lydia Hawthorne, 22 years old, the CEO's niece, strutted in like she owned the building, which, in her mind, she practically did. Her designer heels echoed across the floor as she dropped a folder onto my desk. "Reassign the Northbridge team," she said flatly. "I don't like them. They push back too much." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stand up. "Lydia," I said calmly, "they just closed a $4 million contract. I'm not dismantling a team because you're uncomfortable." Her smile vanished. "You work for this family," she snapped. "When I give instructions, you follow them." I leaned back in my chair. I take direction from executives who understand the business, not relatives collecting titles. Her face flushed red. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I'll make sure of it." I knew then that this wouldn't end quietly. A few months earlier, my boss, Gerald Hawthorne, had announced Lydia would be joining Leadership for Experience. Most of us assumed she'd sit in on meetings, get bored, and disappear. Instead, she was handed a vague operational title with real authority and zero accountability. At first, I protected the company from her. I corrected her errors before clients noticed. I rewrote proposals she broke. I covered missed deadlines she never acknowledged. Not because I respected her, but because I respected my work. The breaking point came 2 weeks before that morning. Lydia stormed into my office and demanded I fire my own team. I refused. That night, during the annual investor reception. My phone buzzed. One message, from Gerald, "Percival, come see me first thing tomorrow." I barely slept. By the time I stepped into his office, I already knew what was coming. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment far longer than they imagined. "How are you really feeling right now, steady? Tired, or quietly carrying more than you show, if you can? Do one small thing for yourself today. Take a short walk after this story and let your thoughts settle naturally. Tell me where you're listening from. It always reminds me we're not alone in these moments. And if this story resonates with you, consider subscribing, because what Percival does next isn't loud, but it's powerful. The email announcing my suspension went out at 9:17 a.m. No explanation, no context, just a single, sterile line informing the company that I was being placed on temporary administrative leave pending internal review. My access badge stopped working before I reached the elevator. I stood there for a moment, watching the light above the scanner blink red, feeling something unexpected settle in my chest, not panic, not anger, recognition. So this was the move. By noon, the quiet erasure had begun. My calendar vanished. Projects I'd shepherded for years were reassigned overnight. My name disappeared from threads I'd started, plans I'd authored, decisions I'd guided. It was as if the company was trying to pretend I'd never existed. Lydia didn't even bother hiding her satisfaction. I caught her once, laughing softly in the hallway with 2 junior managers who'd never spoken to me before. She didn't look at me directly, just tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they believe the outcome is already sealed. What she didn't understand was that people like me notice patterns long before others notice danger. 3 months earlier, I'd started to feel the shift. Clients asking cautious questions, legal teams requesting clarification on decisions I hadn't made, contracts I'd negotiated being rerouted through Lydia for visibility. It wasn't subtle, it was strategic. So I adapted. I documented everything, not dramatically, not emotionally, quietly. Every email where Lydia overstepped, every meeting note where she issued instructions she didn't have authority to give, every client concern that landed in my inbox after she insisted on taking the lead. I didn't keep those records on company systems, and I didn't keep them to myself. There were 2 people at Hawthorne Solutions I trusted implicitly, Eleanor Park, head of compliance, and Marcus Reed, senior corporate counsel. Both had worked with me long enough to recognize when a problem wasn't just personality, it was liability. We met outside the office, no agendas, no promises. when I laid everything out. Eleanor went quiet. Marcus read through the summaries twice. "This isn't just reckless," Marcus finally said. "This could expose the board." That was the moment they understood why I wasn't fighting my suspension. I didn't need to. By the end of that week, Eleanor had begun a formal internal review. Marcus drafted confidential risk memos outlining potential breaches of fiduciary duty. Neither document had my name on it. Meanwhile, I made one more call, one Lydia didn't know about. Northbridge Logistics, the client she'd dismissed, the team she'd wanted gone. They trusted me, not the Hawthorne name, me. And when they asked, quietly, whether leadership changes were coming, I told them the truth. I don't know yet, I said, but I wouldn't bet on stability. They heard exactly what they needed to hear. By Monday, Lydia thought she'd won. By Monday night, the board had begun asking questions, and I was done being erased. The strange thing about being pushed out is how quickly people reveal what they really valued about you. By the second week of my suspension, my phone started ringing not with apologies, but with questions. Quiet ones, careful ones. The kind people ask when they sense the ground beneath them isn't as solid as it used to be. A regional manager wanted clarification on a clause I'd negotiated. A compliance analyst asked whether a certain reporting shortcut Lydia had approved was standard practice. A client liaison hinted that Northbridge wasn't thrilled about recent changes. I answered none of them directly. Instead, I listened. Patterns emerged fast. Lydia had moved aggressively since my suspension, inserting herself into contracts she didn't understand, overriding review steps she considered bureaucratic, and pressuring teams to accelerate timelines that legally couldn't move faster. On paper, everything still looked clean. In reality, the margins for error were shrinking by the day. Eleanor called me late one evening. "We've flagged 3 transactions," she said. "Individually, they're questionable. Together, they're a trend. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. What does Marcus think I asked? He thinks the board won't ignore this." She replied, "But they won't act without external pressure. That was the missing piece. Pressure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from absence." Northbridge Logistics delayed their renewal meeting. Officially, it was a scheduling issue. Unofficially, their legal team had started asking whether recent operational decisions aligned with prior assurances I'd personally made. Then another client paused a pilot program. Then a third requested temporary clarification on governance oversight. None of them mentioned Lydia by name. They didn't have to. Inside Hawthorne Solutions, the mood shifted. Meetings grew tense. Departments began documenting their own decisions defensively. Managers stopped acting and started covering themselves. And Lydia noticed. She called me for the first time since my suspension. Her tone was forced casual. "You've been talking to people. I've been available," I said evenly. "You're undermining me." She snapped. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I'm not employed. I don't have that power." She hung up without another word. 2 days later, Marcus texted me a single sentence: "The board has requested a closed-door session. No executives invited." I stared at the message for a long moment. This was the phase people misunderstand. They think revenge is loud, sudden, emotional. It isn't. Real consequences arrive quietly, through processes no one can interrupt once they've begun. Lydia still thought this was a family matter. She didn't realize it had already become a governance problem. And governance, unlike entitlement, doesn't care who your uncle is. This is where careful listeners lean in. Are you still with me? The invitation arrived without ceremony. No subject line, no greeting, just a calendar block forwarded by Marcus with a short note beneath it. Be available. They may want context. They didn't call it a hearing. They never do. Boards prefer language that sounds neutral, procedural safe, but everyone involved understood what a closed-door session without executives meant. Someone was being evaluated, and it wasn't me. I wasn't asked to attend. Not yet. Instead, the board began where they always do: paper. Reports, timelines, email trails. Eleanor's compliance findings were presented alongside Marcus's legal risk assessments, stripped of emotion and opinion, just facts. Arranged carefully, impossible to misinterpret. By the end of that first session, Lydia's name appeared more often than mine ever had. That alone was telling. The second meeting came 2 days later. This time, department heads were interviewed individually. No group discussions, no opportunity to align stories. One by one. People were asked the same questions, phrased slightly differently. Who authorized this change? Why was this review bypassed? When did this directive come down? Consistency breaks under repetition. By midweek. The internal messaging shifted. Lydia's initiatives were paused. Her meetings were suddenly rescheduled. Approvals she once rubber-stamped now required secondary review. She noticed immediately. She cornered Gerald outside the executive conference room. I wasn't there, but Eleanor was. She told me later that Lydia's voice shook not with anger, but confusion. "They're treating me like a risk," Lydia said. "This is ridiculous." Gerald tried to calm her. He always did. Soft words, vague reassurances. But this time, it didn't work, because the board hadn't asked for his opinion. They asked for data. That night, Lydia called again. This time, there was no pretense. "You planned this," she said flatly. "You turned them against me. I kept my voice even. I documented what happened. You wanted me gone." "No," I said. "I wanted the company protected." There was a long silence on the line. "You think you're untouchable," she finally said. I almost laughed. "No," I replied. "I think processes are—" She hung up. The next morning, Gerald requested a private meeting with the board chair. Not to defend Lydia, he couldn't anymore, but to protect himself. That was when the tone changed again. Boards forgive ignorance. Sometimes, they rarely forgive complicity. By the end of the week, Lydia's access to strategic systems was restricted pending review. Her authority was quietly narrowed. Her title remained, but it had become decorative. She still showed up to meetings, but no one looked to her for decisions. That's the moment entitlement collapses, not when power is taken away, but when it stops being acknowledged. And for the first time since this began, I realized something. The board wasn't just correcting a mistake. They were preparing to replace it. The call came late Friday afternoon. Unknown number. Board line. I let it ring once before answering. "Mr. Brooks," the voice said, calm and measured. "This is Harold Whitman, chair of the board at Hawthorne Solutions. We'd like to speak with you. Not plead, not apologize. Speak." That distinction mattered. We met the following Monday in a conference room I'd never been invited into before. 12 seats, thick glass walls, no nameplates, no hierarchy at least, not an obvious one. Lydia wasn't there, neither was Gerald. That told me everything. They didn't accuse me of anything. They didn't ask defensive questions. Instead, they asked about my work, my decisions, the contracts I'd negotiated, the risks I'd quietly neutralized long before anyone noticed there was a problem. I answered factually, without emotion. Every statement backed by documentation I'd already shared with compliance and legal. Halfway through, Harold leaned forward. "Why didn't you come to the board earlier?" I paused because I believed the company could correct itself internally, and because I didn't want governance to become a weapon. A few heads nodded. Another director asked, "If reinstated, could you stabilize the Northbridge account? I never left it." I said, "I stepped back so the consequences would be visible." That earned me a long look. They didn't decide anything that day. Boards rarely do, but when the meeting ended, Harold walked me to the door. "We'll be moving quickly," he said. "I suggest you remain available. Available, not hopeful." That evening, Gerald called. He sounded older, smaller. "They're asking questions I can't answer," he admitted, "about things Lydia approved, things I allowed." I didn't respond. "You always understood this business better than anyone," he continued. I should have listened. I let the silence do the work. On Tuesday, an internal memo announced a temporary leadership realignment. Lydia was reassigned to a non-operational advisory role. Gerald would remain CEO for now, but under enhanced board oversight. Corporate language for probation. Northbridge Logistics resumed contact the same day. They requested a meeting with me by Wednesday. I was back in the building, not reinstated, not announced, just present. People noticed. Conversations stopped when I walked past, then resumed, quieter. Power doesn't announce itself. It's felt. Thursday afternoon, Harold called again. "The board would like you to step in as interim director of operations," he said. "Effective immediately." I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. "I have conditions," I replied. He chuckled softly. "We assumed you would, because this wasn't about getting my job back. It was about deciding what came next and who would never be allowed to decide again. If you think you understand, the next paragraph will change your mind." I returned to my office without ceremony. No announcement, no welcome back email. My badge worked again, that was all. The desk was exactly as I'd left it, untouched, as if the company itself had been waiting. By 10 o'clock a.m., I had my first meeting. Not with executives, but with the people who actually made Hawthorne Solutions, function operations leads, compliance analysts, client liaisons. The invitation was simple review session, mandatory. No Lydia, no Gerald. That absence was intentional. I started with facts. What had stalled? What had been rerouted? What had been approved without review? I didn't assign blame. I didn't need to. People filled in the gaps themselves. From now on, I said, no directive overrides contract safeguards, ever. If someone pressures you to skip review, you escalate, directly, to me. No one objected. Eleanor followed with compliance updates, quiet confirmations that several processes would be formally reinstated. Marcus outlined new documentation requirements not as punishment, but protection. By lunchtime, the tone of the building had shifted. Departments moved with purpose again. Questions were asked openly. Decisions slowed just enough to become deliberate. That afternoon, I met with Northbridge Logistics. They didn't bring legal counsel. That was the signal. We needed to know whether competence still mattered here. Their director said, "It does," I replied, "and it will." They renewed their commitment on the spot the next day. I addressed Lydia's former portfolio. She wasn't present, but her influence lingered half-finished initiatives, vague mandates, confusion disguised as momentum. I dismantled it methodically. Projects were reassigned, authority clarified, titles adjusted to match actual responsibility. No drama, just alignment. Gerald requested a meeting late that week. He looked exhausted. "I'm stepping down," he said quietly. "The board made it clear." I nodded. "That's probably for the best." He hesitated. "You could have destroyed us." I met his gaze. I didn't want to win. I wanted the company to survive. He exhaled, something between relief and regret. The official announcement came Monday morning. Gerald Hawthorne would resign to support leadership transition. Lydia Hawthorne's advisory role would conclude effective immediately. No farewell messages, no explanations. By 3:30 p.m., the office felt lighter. People worked without glancing over their shoulders. Conversations happened in full sentences again. Decisions were owned. Harold called once more. "The board is pleased," he said. "We'd like to discuss permanence." I looked out over the city from my office window. "I'll listen," I said. "But stability comes first, because execution isn't about revenge. It's about building something strong enough that entitlement never finds a foothold again." The collapse didn't arrive with headlines. There were no emergency meetings, no raised voices echoing through glass walls. What happened to Lydia and to the version of Hawthorne Solutions built around her unfolded the way real consequences usually do, quietly, in stages, impossible to reverse once they began. Her access was revoked on a Tuesday morning. By 11 o'clock a.m., her name had been removed from internal directories. By afternoon, her projects had been formally archived under structural review. No one said the word failure, but everyone understood it. Lydia didn't come back after that day. I heard later she'd tried to enter the building the following morning, arguing with security, insisting it was a mistake. It wasn't. The system had already moved on. Clients noticed before employees did. Northbridge renewed publicly, citing restored operational confidence. 2 other partners followed within the week. Their messages were polite, professional, and pointed. Stability had returned, and they intended to reward it. The market reacted the same way. Subtle at first, then visible, internally. The atmosphere transformed. Not celebratory, focused. Teams rebuilt trust with the kind of relief that only comes after sustained pressure lifts. Harold called me in for a private discussion. "The board is aligned," he said. "We want continuity. We want you." I didn't answer immediately. Power offered too quickly is often power misunderstood. "I'll accept," I said finally. "With conditions." He smiled faintly. "We expected that." I laid them out plainly. No family appointments without board review, transparent performance metrics for leadership, compliance authority independent of executive influence, no exceptions. Harold didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded. Agreed. The vote was unanimous. The announcement went out that Friday. I was named Vice President of Operations, effective immediately. No applause, no speeches, Just a short email outlining responsibility and reporting lines. That was enough. I walked past Lydia's old office later that day. The nameplate was gone, the desk empty. No trace she'd ever been there. Entitlement leaves no legacy. Gerald sent a final message before his departure. You were right. It read, I should have protected the company instead of the family. I didn't reply. Some lessons don't need acknowledgement. A month later, Hawthorne Solutions closed its strongest quarter in 2 years. Not because of bold moves or flashy leadership, but because decisions were grounded again. People worked without fear. Looking back, I understand something clearly now. Lydia didn't lose because she was young or inexperienced. She lost because she believed authority replaced accountability. It never does. And in the end, what she mistook for revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was governance doing exactly what it's supposed to do. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. I didn't expect to see Lydia again. People like her don't come back to confront what they've lost. They rewrite the story, instead change cities, change circles, pretend the ending was a misunderstanding rather than a consequence. So when Eleanor told me Lydia had requested a meeting, I was surprised, not curious, just aware. We met in a neutral space, not my office, not hers. A small conference room on the ground floor, walls bare, no symbols of authority left to lean on. She arrived alone, no entourage, no confidence armor, just a young woman trying to look composed while failing to hide how much had been taken from her. This isn't fair, she said, before sitting down. I let the silence stretch. You never gave me a chance, she continued. You decided I was incompetent before I even started. I folded my hands on the table. You had authority without responsibility. That's not a chance, that's a risk. Her jaw tightened. They sided with you because you manipulated them. They sided with documentation, I replied calmly. And with clients who value stability? She laughed bitterly. You act like you're some kind of hero. I don't, I said. I act like someone who understands systems. That word landed heavier than I expected. Systems. They don't care about intentions or bloodlines or charm. They care about inputs and outcomes. You could have helped me, she said quietly. I did, I replied, repeatedly. You didn't listen. Her eyes flicked away. There it was. Not anger, not entitlement, recognition. I lost everything, she said. No, I corrected gently. You lost influence. That's different. She stood, suddenly unsteady. What happens now? I considered the question. Now, I said. You learn what everyone else learns eventually. Titles don't create trust. Competence does. She didn't respond, just nodded once and left. That was the last conversation we ever had. Back upstairs, work resumed without interruption. Contracts moved forward. Teams planned long-term again. The company stopped reacting and started building. That evening, Harold sent me the final contract draft. Permanent role, expanded authority, clear boundaries. I signed without hesitation, not because I wanted power, because I understood what it protected. Months later, Hawthorne Solutions looked nothing like the place Lydia had tried to control. Leadership was quieter, decisions slower, results stronger, and I understood something else. 2. Revenge stories usually end with someone humiliated. This one didn't. It ended with something rarer, balance, because when entitlement collapses under its own weight, the people who survive aren't the loudest. They're the ones who built something solid enough to stand when everything else fell away. The months that followed didn't feel victorious. They felt steady. No urgent calls after midnight, no whispered rumors sliding through hallways, no executives glancing over their shoulders before speaking. Hawthorne Solutions had entered something unfamiliar, normalcy. That, more than anything, told me how broken things had been before. I spent those months doing the least dramatic work imaginable, rebuilding review protocols, clarifying authority lines, listening more than speaking. Power, I learned, isn't about visibility. It's about reducing friction so others can function. People began to trust the silence. One afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by my office. She hesitated in the doorway like she expected to be turned away. I just wanted to say thank you, she said. For slowing things down. I nodded. That's usually where mistakes hide. She smiled, relieved, and left. Those moments mattered more than board votes ever had. Externally, The market responded in ways analysts like to pretend are unpredictable. Contract renewals accelerated. Clients who'd quietly reduced exposure returned. Reputation repaired itself without a press release, internally. Something subtler happened. People stopped talking about Lydia, not out of fear, out of irrelevance. Her name no longer explained delays or mistakes. There was no villain to hide behind. Accountability had nowhere to deflect. Gerald's departure became a footnote, a line in an annual report. Even the Hawthorne name began to recede into the background, replaced by process, performance, and consistency. One evening, Marcus joined me for dinner. "You know," he said, "this could have ended very differently." I nodded. "It usually does." "You didn't take shortcuts," he added. "That's rare. It's expensive," I replied. "Short term." He raised his glass. "Worth it. The board requested a long-term strategic plan before year's end, not an expansion pitch, a resilience framework. What happens when leadership fails? How systems correct themselves before damage becomes public. I wrote it myself. The final page wasn't about metrics. It was about culture, when the board approved it unanimously. Harold looked at me with something close to respect. "You changed how this company thinks," he said. I shook my head. I just removed the noise. Later that night, alone in my office, I looked out over the city again. I thought about the version of myself who'd sat here months earlier, waiting for an email that would end everything. I remembered the badge scanner blinking red, the quiet humiliation, the assumption that I'd been erased. I hadn't been erased. I'd been exposed to the truth, that systems either protect the competent or they collapse under those who confuse authority with worth. Hawthorne Solutions survived because it chose the former, and I stayed not out of loyalty, but responsibility. Because rebuilding isn't glamorous, but it's the only kind of justice that lasts. A year later, Hawthorne Solutions no longer felt like the company I'd once fought to protect. It was better, not bigger, not louder, just grounded. The kind of place where decisions didn't hinge on last names, and authority didn't need to announce itself to be real. The board met less often, crises became rare, people stopped bracing for impact every time leadership shifted. That was the real victory. I never ran into Lydia again. I heard fragments. Of course, a short stint at a boutique consulting firm, a failed attempt to launch a startup with borrowed credibility. Nothing catastrophic, nothing triumphant, just quiet displacement. And that felt right, because this was never about ruining her life. It was about removing her from a position she was never ready to hold. One evening, long after most of the building had emptied, I stayed behind to finish reviewing a compliance audit. The lights reflected off the glass walls the same way they had the night before my suspension. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember that version of me, the one who thought integrity would protect him automatically. It doesn't. Integrity only matters when systems are willing to enforce it. That was the lesson Hawthorne Solutions had learned the hard way. I walked past the lobby, where new hires now passed through orientation without knowing the names of the people who'd nearly broken the company. They didn't need to. What matters isn't who fell. It's what was built afterward. The board offered me a seat 6 months later. I declined, not because I didn't care, but because my work was done best where execution met accountability, not where oversight became abstraction. They respected that decision more than any acceptance speech could have earned. Northbridge Logistics became a long-term partner, others followed. Growth returned, measured and deliberate, and occasionally, someone new would ask, how did things change so much so quickly? I never told them the full story. I'd just say, we learned to listen to data, to people, to consequences. That was enough, looking back. I realized something important. Revenge is often framed as destruction, but the most lasting form of it, the kind that doesn't corrode you from the inside, is restoration. Restoring process, restoring dignity, restoring the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to fight dirty to win. Lydia thought power was inherited. Gerald thought it could be deferred. They were both wrong. Power is earned daily through consistency, restraint, and the willingness to let systems work even when they expose uncomfortable truths. As for me, I didn't walk away richer in ego. I walked away clearer. Clear about who I am, clear about what I won't tolerate, clear about the kind of organization I'll help build or refuse to be part of. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: when someone tries to erase you to protect their comfort, Don't rush to prove your worth. Build something so solid that their absence becomes inevitable. Because in the end, the loudest people rarely last, but the ones who understand how things actually work. They don't need revenge. They become the standard. I didn't tell this story to prove I was right. I told it because moments like this happen quietly to more people than we realize, and how we respond is what shapes everything that comes after. For me, the lesson was simple, but not easy. Dignity doesn't come from titles or approval. It comes from staying steady when you're pushed aside. As you listened, how did this story make you feel? Did you stay with me until the end? And if so, what moment stayed with you the most? I'm curious what kind of story you'd like to hear next, because many battles happen in silence, and each one teaches something different. Let me know where you're listening from right now. It means more than you might think. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love it if you shared your thoughts in the comments, gave the video a like, shared it with someone who might need it, and subscribed so we can keep telling these stories together.